They expected to hate them. Every American sailor who stood watch in the gray dawn hours of 1905, scanning the horizon for the first sign of incoming aircraft, expected to feel nothing but pure speed for the men who came to die. And for many, that hatred did come, burning hot and righteous in those terrible moments when a Japanese plane broke through the clouds and aimed itself at their ship like a living bullet. But what they did not expect, what no training manual or officer briefing could have prepared them for, was the other feeling that crept in afterward. It was not hatred that kept them awake at night. It was something far more troubling. It was the thought that the pilot, in those final seconds before impact, had been terrified too. It was the realization that the enemy was not a demon or a machine, but a young man who might have been shaking at the controls, might have been crying, might have been praying to a god he was no longer sure existed. This was the contradiction that haunted the men who survived the kamikaze attacks. They had been taught to see their enemy as inhuman, as fanatics beyond reason, as creatures of pure devotion to death. But the truth they discovered was far more complex, and in some ways, far more disturbing. The enemy was human after all. The first large-scale kamikaze attacks came in October 1904 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. American sailors had heard rumors of Japanese pilots crashing into ships, but many dismissed these stories as accidents or desperate acts by damaged aircraft. The idea that any military would organize suicide attacks as official strategy seemed impossible to believe. Surely no nation would ask its young men to become living missiles. Surely no pilot would willingly give up his life when he might instead drop his bombs and return to fight another day. These assumptions dissolved in smoke and fire over the Philippine Sea. Seaman Robert Jensen, stationed aboard a destroyer escort, remembered the first time he saw a kamikaze diving toward a nearby carrier. The plane came out of the morning sun, engine screaming, and for a moment he thought it was damaged, thought it was going to pull up at the last second. It did not pull up. It struck the flight deck at full speed, and the explosion that followed seemed to shake the very ocean beneath his feet. He felt the heat on his face from half a mile away. He heard the screams carried across the water. And in that moment, something shifted inside him that would never quite shift back. What Jensen expected to feel was satisfaction. An enemy plane destroyed, a threat eliminated. What he actually felt was a strange emptiness, followed by a question he could not silence. What kind of man flies a plane into a ship on purpose? The question would haunt him for months, and he was not alone. Across the Pacific Fleet, thousands of sailors found themselves asking the same thing. They talked about it during quiet moments, in mess halls and engine rooms, and on deck during night watches. They talked about it the way men talk about things they cannot understand, with equal parts anger and confusion. The name carried deep historical meaning. In the 13th century, 2 great typhoons had destroyed Mongol invasion fleets heading for Japan, and these storms were believed to be sent by the gods to protect the sacred islands. Now, in the desperate final years of a losing war, Japanese military leaders hoped that young pilots could become a new divine wind, sweeping away the American ships that threatened to invade the homeland. The poetry of the name masked the brutal reality of what was being asked. American sailors quickly learned what it meant to be the target of this new form of warfare. It was not like facing conventional attacks, where skill and luck and training might keep you alive. Kamikaze pilots were not trying to hit their targets and escape. They were the weapon itself. An anti-aircraft gunner could shoot a plane full of holes, could kill the pilot a dozen times over, but as long as the aircraft kept falling toward the ship, it remained deadly. A burning, disintegrating plane still carried bombs, still carried fuel, still carried hundreds of pounds of metal traveling at hundreds of miles per hour. The dead could still kill. This created a particular kind of terror that was different from any other combat experience. James Morrison, a gunner on the cruiser USS Birmingham, described it as a fear that never stopped, not even when the all clear sounded. In a conventional battle, there were moments of safety, moments when the enemy planes turned away or the attack ended. But kamikaze attacks felt personal in a way that nothing else did. The pilot was not trying to damage your ship and go home. He was trying to die on your deck. He was using his own body as a weapon against your body. There was an intimacy to it that Morrison found deeply unsettling. The psychological strain on American sailors during the Okinawa campaign, where kamikaze attacks reached their peak, was enormous. Ships would remain at general quarters for days at a time, crews sleeping in short shifts by their guns, eating cold food when they ate at all. The constant vigilance wore men down in ways that pure combat could not. They developed what doctors would later call combat fatigue, and what we might today recognize as post-traumatic stress. Some men broke down completely, shaking and crying and unable to perform their duties. Others went quiet, their eyes hollow, their movements mechanical. What made it worse was the unpredictability. Kamikaze attacks could come at any time, from any direction. Dawn was particularly dangerous, when pilots would use the rising sun to hide their approach. Sunset was dangerous too, when exhausted gunners had to squint into the fading light. Cloudy days offered no protection, as planes could drop out of overcast skies with almost no warning. Even radar, the great technological advantage of the American fleet, could not always provide enough time to prepare. The planes came too fast, too low, too suddenly. And yet, amid all this terror, something unexpected began to happen. American sailors started to think about the men flying those planes, not as abstractions or symbols, but as individuals. It began with small things. A pilot seen through binoculars just before impact, who looked impossibly young. A hand painted on the side of a fuselage, the print of a man who would be dead in minutes. A face glimpsed in a cockpit, eyes wide, mouth open, features frozen in an expression that might have been rage or might have been fear. William Draper, a radar operator on a destroyer off Okinawa, remembered a kamikaze that missed his ship by only yards. The plane hit the water and broke apart, and in the wreckage that floated past, Draper saw a small cloth bundle. Someone fished it out with a boat hook. Inside was a photograph of a young woman and a child, and a letter written in neat Japanese characters that no one on board could read. Draper kept that photograph for years. He did not know why. He only knew that he could not bring himself to throw it away. It was not the bombs that haunted him, but the photograph. It was not the explosions, but the letter he could never read. Similar stories multiplied across the fleet. Sailors recovered personal effects from downed pilots. They found good luck charms and prayer beads and locks of hair. They found poems written on rice paper, folded carefully and tucked into flight suits. They found photographs of parents and girlfriends and little brothers. Each item was a small window into a life that had ended violently. And each window made it harder to see the enemy as simply a monster to be destroyed. This did not mean that American sailors stopped fighting. They fought with everything they had, because they wanted to live, because they wanted to go home, because they had friends to protect and duties to perform. But their hatred became complicated. It mixed with confusion and with something that some men refused to name. It might have been pity. It might have been a terrible recognition of shared humanity. Whatever it was, it made the war feel different. The Japanese pilots themselves were far from the fanatics that American propaganda portrayed. Many were university students who had been drafted, young men with hopes and dreams that extended far beyond the cockpit of a Zero fighter. Some believed deeply in their mission, genuinely convinced that their deaths would save Japan from invasion and destruction. But many others were filled with doubt, terror, and grief. They went to their deaths not because they wanted to die, but because they saw no honorable way to refuse. The pressure on these young men was immense and came from every direction. Japanese military culture demanded absolute obedience and viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. Pilots who expressed hesitation were shamed by their officers and sometimes by their own families. Some were told that their parents would be dishonored if they refused. Others were told that their deaths would secure places in paradise, that they would become gods themselves, that their spirits would forever protect the nation. The language was beautiful. The reality was brutal. Corporal Yukio Seki, often credited as the first kamikaze pilot, reportedly said to a journalist before his mission that he was going to die not for the emperor or for glory, but because he had been ordered to. He said that Japan was already lost, that the war could not be won, that his death would accomplish nothing. He said that he wished he could have been allowed to use his skills as a pilot to sink ships and return home. He said these things quietly, sadly, and then he climbed into his plane and flew into an American escort carrier. He was 23 years old. Many pilots wrote final letters to their parents that were later discovered and published. These letters reveal the complex emotions behind the attacks. Some expressed genuine fervor, a willingness to die for country and emperor. But many others expressed sorrow, fear, and a desperate love for the people they were leaving behind. One pilot wrote that he was not afraid to die, but that he was terribly sad he would never taste his mother's cooking again. Another wrote that he dreamed of his younger sister's laughter and that it pained him to think she would grow up without him. These were not the words of fanatics. They were the words of frightened boys trying to be brave. The ritual before departure was designed to deepen commitment and cut ties with the living world. Pilots would drink sake from special cups and write final poems. They would visit shrines and receive white headbands, symbolizing purity and death. Some were given small bags of rice from their hometowns, the last taste of home they would ever know. Officers would give inspiring speeches about honor and sacrifice and the eternal glory that awaited. And then the young men would climb into their planes, often older models that could be spared from conventional combat, and take off toward the American fleet. Some pilots never reached their targets. Mechanical failures claimed many aircraft, as did American fighters flying combat air patrol. Anti-aircraft guns took a terrible toll, filling the sky with explosions and shrapnel. Historians estimate that only about 14% of kamikaze aircraft actually struck their targets. The rest were shot down, crashed into the sea, or turned back due to engine trouble. But even these statistics carry hidden tragedy, for they mean that many pilots died for nothing, their sacrifices swallowed by the indifferent ocean. There are also documented cases of pilots who changed their minds. Some simply flew away, landing at other bases or crashing into empty water rather than completing their missions. A few returned to base and faced the terrible consequences of their refusal. Japanese military authorities were not merciful to those who failed to die as ordered. Some were executed. Others were sent on second missions from which there would be no return. The path of refusal was narrow and led only to different kinds of death. American sailors knew almost nothing of this at the time. They saw only the planes coming toward them, saw only the explosions and the fires and the broken bodies of their friends. But some began to sense the truth through sheer observation. The planes were often old and slow, not the best aircraft in the Japanese fleet. The pilots did not fly with the skill of veterans, but with the hesitation of men learning their craft. Some planes made clumsy approaches, easy targets for experienced gunners. Some pilots seemed to waver before impact, as if fighting themselves in those final moments. And occasionally, very occasionally, a plane would suddenly turn away at the last instant, diving into the sea instead of the ship. Lieutenant Thomas Warren witnessed such an event off Okinawa in May 1945. A kamikaze was coming directly at his destroyer, low and fast, and every gun on the ship was firing. Warren was certain they were about to die, but at the last possible second, the plane banked sharply to the left and plunged into the water barely 50 yards from the ship. Warren never knew if the pilot had been hit or if he had simply chosen not to complete his mission. He never knew if that young man had looked at the ship full of frightened sailors and found he could not do it. But he thought about it for the rest of his life. It was not the near miss that stayed with him, but the not knowing. It was not the violence, but the possibility of mercy. The toll on American ships was significant, but not decisive. Kamikaze attacks sank approximately 50 vessels and damaged many more. They killed nearly 5,000 sailors and wounded thousands of others. The attacks terrified and demoralized the American fleet, forced changes in tactics, and stretched medical and repair facilities to their limits. By any measure, they were a serious threat, but they could not stop the American advance. They could not prevent the fall of Okinawa. They could not save Japan from defeat. The divine wind was not strong enough. This was the grim mathematics that Japanese military leaders refused to confront. They kept sending young men to their deaths long after any rational hope of victory had vanished. They convinced themselves that enough sacrifice might yet turn the tide, that the spiritual power of absolute devotion might overcome American material superiority. It was a fantasy written in blood, and the blood was mostly that of boys who had never wanted to die. After the war, American occupation forces discovered vast caches of documents related to the Kamikaze program. They found training manuals and mission reports and personal letters that had never been sent. They found photographs of smiling pilots standing beside their aircraft, arms around each other's shoulders, looking for all the world like college students on a field trip. They found lists of names, thousands of names, each one representing a life that ended in smoke and fire over the Pacific. American veterans who studied these documents often found their views changing. The hatred that had burned so hot during combat began to cool into something more complicated. They read the words of their former enemies and recognized the same fears, the same loves, the same desperate hopes that they themselves had felt. They saw that the Kamikaze pilots were not mysterious Oriental fanatics, but young men caught in a terrible machine, ground between the gears of war and honor and politics. This did not erase the anger. Many veterans never forgave the men who had killed their friends, and that anger was their right to hold. But it sat alongside a growing understanding that the pilots too had been victims, trapped by a culture and a military that offered them no acceptable way to live. The contradiction remained, and perhaps it always would. You could hate a man for trying to kill you and pity him for being forced to die. You could be grateful he failed and sorry he had to try. Some veterans met former Kamikaze pilots in the years and decades after the war. These meetings were sometimes arranged by peace organizations, sometimes happened by chance. They were awkward, painful, difficult. Men who had tried to kill each other sat across tables in hotel conference rooms, searching for words in languages neither fully understood. But occasionally, something remarkable happened. A handshake that became an embrace. A shared meal that became a friendship. Tears that washed away, if only for a moment, the old walls of enmity. One such meeting occurred in 1985, when a group of American Okinawa veterans traveled to Japan to meet survivors of the Kamikaze Corps. Among them was a former anti-aircraft gunner named Frank Morrison, no relation to James, who had spent 40 years dreaming about the pilots he had shot down. He carried a heavy weight of memory, a mixture of pride and guilt that he had never quite untangled. He had done his duty. He had saved his ship. But he had also killed young men who were barely older than boys, and sometimes, in his dreams, he saw their faces. Morrison met a former pilot named Takeshi Nakamura, who had been scheduled to fly a kamikaze mission on August 15, 1945, the day Japan surrendered. Nakamura had spent his life wondering why he had been spared when so many of his friends had died. He felt a survivor's guilt that mirrored Morrison's killer's guilt. The two men talked for hours, first through an interpreter and later through gestures and shared photographs and the universal language of old soldiers everywhere. By the end of the day, they understood each other in ways that no one who had not lived through those times could ever fully grasp. What Morrison discovered was not an enemy, but a mirror. What Nakamura discovered was not a demon, but a fellow survivor. The passage of time has not simplified the moral questions raised by kamikaze tactics. Military historians continue to debate their effectiveness, their necessity, their justice. Some argue that they prolonged the war and increased the suffering on all sides. Others argue that they gave Japanese leaders an illusion of hope that delayed the inevitable surrender. A few have even suggested that they influenced the American decision to use atomic bombs by convincing planners that an invasion of Japan would face fanatical resistance at every step. These debates will never be fully resolved. What can be said with certainty is that the kamikaze program represented a failure of moral imagination on the part of Japanese military leadership. It treated young men as expendable resources rather than as human beings with inherent worth. It demanded the ultimate sacrifice while offering nothing in return but empty promises of glory. It corrupted the genuine bravery of its participants into a tool for hopeless strategic goals. And it left scars on both sides that have never fully healed. The American sailors who survived the kamikaze attacks carried those experiences for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, plagued by nightmares and flashbacks, and an inability to feel safe even decades after the war ended. Some turned to alcohol. Some retreated from family and friends. Some refused to talk about what they had seen, burying the memories so deep that they never surfaced again. And some, a remarkable few, found ways to transform their suffering into understanding. These were the men who wrote memoirs and gave interviews and traveled back to the places where they had fought. They spoke to school children and documentary filmmakers and anyone who would listen about what war really meant. They did not glorify their experiences, but they did not hide from them either. They tried to tell the truth, with all its contradictions and complications, so that future generations might learn something from their pain. And the truth they most wanted to convey was this: that their enemies had been human beings. That the kamikaze pilots, for all the horror they caused, were not monsters but men. That understanding this did not excuse anything, did not justify anything, did not make the violence acceptable. It simply made it real. It reminded those who listened that war is not fought between abstractions, but between people, and that every death diminishes the human family. It was not the killing that aged them, but the recognition. It was not the battles, but the understanding that came after. Today, in Gairan, Japan, there stands a peace museum dedicated to the kamikaze pilots. Visitors can see the letters they wrote, the photographs they left behind, the personal effects they carried into battle. American veterans have visited this museum and stood before these displays, reading translations of final words written by men they once tried desperately to kill. Some have wept, some have left offerings, some have stood in silence, lost in memories of fire and fear and youth that vanished too quickly. The museum does not celebrate war, it mourns it. It asks visitors to consider the cost of extremism, the price of blind obedience, the tragedy of lives cut short by forces beyond individual control. It challenges comfortable narratives on all sides, refusing to let anyone leave without confronting hard questions about responsibility and choice, and the limits of what any nation should ask of its young. The kamikaze tactics of World War II remain one of history's most disturbing innovations. They forced everyone who encountered them to reconsider what they thought they knew about courage and cowardice, about duty and death, about what separates a hero from a victim. They revealed that the human capacity for destruction is matched only by the human capacity for self-sacrifice. and that sometimes these two capacities become terribly intertwined. The sailors who survived understood something that those who have never faced such moments cannot fully grasp. They understood that hatred is simple, but truth is complex. They understood that enemies can be victims too, and that recognizing this does not make you weak. They understood that the young men who dove their planes into American ships were not all fanatics, were not all zealots, were not all willing sacrifices on the altar of Imperial Japan. Some were just boys who wanted to live and were not allowed to. This is what the soldiers really thought about kamikaze tactics when they allowed themselves to think at all. They thought that it was horrible and terrifying and wasteful and sad. They thought that they were glad to be alive and guilty about being glad. They thought about the pilots they killed and the pilots who killed their friends, and they could not always tell if what they felt was hatred or grief or some strange mixture of both. They thought that war demanded things of everyone that no one should have to give. And in the end, when the guns fell silent and the planes stopped coming and the ocean returned to its ancient indifference, they thought about the letters they would never read and the photographs they could not throw away. They thought about young men in cockpits, hands on controls, hearts racing, prayers on lips, diving toward something they could never escape. They thought about how thin the line is between heroism and tragedy, between devotion and destruction, between dying for something and dying for nothing. They carried these thoughts home with them, across the decades, into old age and memory and eventual peace. And if you listen carefully to the stories they left behind, you can hear the contradiction that never resolved, the question that never found its answer, the recognition that haunts all survivors of all wars everywhere. The enemy was human after all. And there are thousands more stories like this, waiting to be remembered.